Good afternoon, good morning. Welcome back to our course on accelerating the implementation of science, technology, and innovation strategy for Africa, STISA-2024. Today, we are going to cover two modules which are focused on the strategy itself, STISA. And we'll spend some time discussing what this strategy is all about. It is historical origins, what its vision, mission, and objectives are, its key priorities, 6 priority areas, implementation strategy for implementation strategy to achieve the goals, the objectives in the strategy. We'll then look at or reflect on some perceptions about the implementation of the strategy, its relevance, its effectiveness. Then we'll move into module 6 and discuss first of all the notion of national domestication of STISA, what domestication is, some of the principles that would guide national domestication of STISA, institutional arrangements at national level to domesticate the strategy STISA. And we'll have some time to talk about tools to monitor, evaluate, and learn to improve STISA's relevance and its implementation. So again, welcome back to the course. Just to recap what we covered in the previous modules, very briefly, we started off week 1. Module 1, reflecting on the key concepts of science, technology, and innovation. We talked about the policy process, STI policy, and we define what policy is, STI policy, what constitutes STI policy, different STI policy instruments. We also emphasize that very often we talk of policy frameworks, regimes of policies, not a single policy measure or policy action, to promote science, technology, and innovation, STI, to govern science, technology, and innovation. We then spent some time discussing the roles that science and technology play in human development in general, sustainable development in particular, and how STI are being integrated in global agendas, in particular sustainable development goals in the African agenda, Agenda 2063. We then in module 4 discussed some emerging national experiences and emphasized that many African countries are starting to design, adopt, and implement STI policies. There are different kinds of policy frameworks with different policy rationales, objectives, institutional arrangements. We then looked at what are some of the barriers and opportunities for getting STI policies designed and implemented at national levels to achieve various objectives, and in some cases, objectives associated with the SDGs and aspirations in Agenda 2063. So today we are moving to really the core of this course. The course, as we all know, is to build our knowledge of STISA, awareness of STISA, what STISA is all about why it's an important policy framework or policy regime. And I want to just go back to the historical origins of STISA, which again, I presume, if you've read the study guide and STISA itself, you will have some sense by now that first and foremost, STISA evolves from previous African efforts, Pan-African efforts at designing STI policy frameworks, policy regimes. In 2005, African leaders adopted what was called Africa's Consolidated Plan for Science and Technology, a program of work which was largely developed by the New Partnership for Africa's Development and the African Union Commission between 2002 and 2005. In September 2005, in Dakar, Senegal, ministers responsible for science and technology adopted the CPA. And the CPA was really a comprehensive plan which brought together two continental plans that were being drafted, but had not been adopted by African political leaders. And these were the African Union Commission's Science and Technology Strategy and the NEPAD program for science, technology, and innovation. So it was agreed by leaders at the African Union level that Africa should not have two STI frameworks being driven by two different African Union organs. The CPA was organized around four pillars. The first pillar was really the R&D pillar. The second was the technology pillar, technology development pillar. The third was the innovation pillar. And then there was another pillar, which was really about policy conditions, improving policy conditions for STI. And as you'll note from the way I've described the CPAs, that it was largely based on the linear model, a linear view of STI, linear view of innovation and the innovation process, that you had to start from R&D, then you move to technology development, then you move to innovation. And then you needed policy conditions, institutions to support that. When the CPA was being designed, actually prevailing conceptual approach or model to innovation was the linear one, which had been prevailing. Although in some countries, the national systems of innovation framework had been adopted, as we discussed again in Module 4. Some countries such as South Africa, Namibia, Botswana had already embraced the systems of innovation approach, which treat the innovation as an interactive process, non-linear interactive process, technological change as cumulative, and recognize the complex interactions of science, technology, and innovation. But with the CPA, the Consolidated Plan, a number of achievements were made. Those include, one is that there was high-level political capital or support built for STI on the continent. Before the CPA, at the African level, it was very rare to get leaders talk about STI. Previous efforts by the then Organization of African Union had not really been successful. For example, in the 80s, African countries went to Lagos and agreed on the Lagos Plan of Action, which had some provisions on R&D. For example, gross expenditure on R&D, target of 1% of GDP. Then in the late 80s, in Arusha, Dar es Salaam, again, there was an African high-level conference on science, technology, but the emphasis was largely on R&D, and not much happened. And then you had a number of initiatives by non-state actors, such as the African Academy of Sciences, in the early 90s, around the Presidential Forum on Research and Development. And not much came out of most of these high-level initiatives, largely because the emphasis was around R&D, and it was very difficult to convince politicians that, in fact, R&D on its own was going to help transformation of African economies. There were countries that were investing, making some investments in R&D, but they were not seeing the economies change, at least qualitatively. So the entry or the coming into being of the CPA, that process through NEPAD and the African Union in general, helped to build this awareness of the role of science, technology, and innovation in economic change. But at the global level, as we discussed in module 3, things were also changing. Recognition that STI are critical to achieve sustainable development. And then after several years, after 5 years, African leaders, through what was then called the African Ministerial Conference on Science and Technology, resolved to review the CPA to find out whether it was making any difference at different levels of governance, at the continental level, at regional and national levels. So they established a high-level panel, a panel of eminent scientists supported by a technical group to review the CPA. And there was consensus that the CPA had made some difference. There was political support or capital for STI. But again, as I said, the CPA was framed, guided by this linear view, and it was important to change that. There were some investments that had been made in R&D. For example, under the CPA, a number of R&D networks for biosciences, with emphasis on biotechnology, with the regional hubs in East Africa, Nairobi, West Africa, in Dakar, Southern Africa in Pretoria, and North Africa in Egypt, to promote R&D in biosciences, in general biotechnology in particular, and a number of scientific outputs were generated. Increased scientific publications from African researchers, a number of scientists trained, PhD, but there was very little transition, if any, to innovation from this continental plan. And there was a need to really sharpen the focus have a strategic approach. There are also other challenges that the review of CPA identified. Those challenges were assured that the CPA was not anchored in or on a continental plan, development plan. So it was not really integrated in a continental plan, because when it was designed, when the CPA was designed and adopted, there was no really a continental development plan. And around 2010, 2011, there were efforts to develop Agenda 2063. So there was need to have a strategic framework or a policy framework that is anchored on a continental development plan, to implement a continental development plan. And so the STISA-20 was developed again through some consultative process. But as we'll discuss later on, it was largely a top-down process, largely a process led by a number of technocrats and independent experts. The mission of STISA, as you read, it is accelerate Africa's transition to an innovation-led, knowledge-based economy. When STISA was adopted in 2014, most countries were talking of knowledge being knowledge-based economies, innovation-led economies. Most countries were talking of transformation of not just the economy, but society in general. Emphasis on industrialization, for example. And this is what, again, as we discussed, is really what Agenda 2063 is all about. So STISA has a very specific mission, which is transition to a knowledge-led, an innovation-led, knowledge-based economy, recognizing that, in fact, innovation, the introduction of new practices, new products, new processes, new services, is what leads to economic change, creating new value. It is not, as we discussed, the mere accumulation of different capitals, financial capitals, or accumulation of skills. It has to be about these products, technologies, processes, being introduced and applied to create value in the economies, to change society, to address societal problems. So there is a specific mission, and that mission is valid. That mission is actually now articulated in most national vision statements, most national development plans of African countries. And the mission is to be achieved by doing a number of things, and those include improving the state of Africa's STI readiness, capabilities of the continent as a whole, of countries. And these capabilities are in terms of infrastructure, R&D infrastructure, and the physical infrastructure in general, technical and professional competencies, what one would call scientific and technological capabilities, but more than that, improving capabilities in entrepreneurship, creating new businesses, managing new businesses. Because without entrepreneurial capabilities, we are not able to effectively engage in the development, procurement, diffusion, and application of new products, new services. So you can actually have technologies out there on the shelf, but you require entrepreneurial capabilities, enterprises that go out, procure, and commercialize the technologies, that get the technologies diffused in the economies. So the first is really STI readiness and capabilities in general. The second is implementing specific policies and programs for STI to address societal needs, societal problems of African countries. And these societal needs and problems are supposed to be shared by African countries. So the mission is there, and at least two means of implementation identified in STISA. Then you have specific objectives, which again are well articulated in the strategy itself. And those objectives, which relate again to the two means, are about effectiveness of STI policies in addressing priority areas, which I'll in a short while introduce. That you want effective policy measures, effective STI. So it's not just STI, but STI has to work for Africa, has to work for the poor in Africa, has to work for African countries. So it's not STI for its own sake. It's not investing in STI for STI's sake. It is to be about implementation of STI and STI policies. And then it's about the competences as we discussed. So it's really an objective. It's not just thought of as a means, but objective training of Africans in various African institutions, building African institutional capacities, including institutional capacities for policy, and then promoting competitiveness through fostering innovation, value addition, and industrial development stroke entrepreneurship. That is not just, again, about addressing basic problems, but Africa has to become really competitive. Africa has to move from exporting low value natural products, whether it's copper, whether it is timber. Africa has to add value to its natural resource exports. Then the production of knowledge, but also the protection of that knowledge, particularly indigenous knowledge, by strengthening intellectual property protection regimes, and strengthening a range of regulatory regimes at all levels of governance. So here you are even talking of measures such as creating a common IP regime for the continent, strengthening the existing intellectual property organizations, African organizations, OAPI and ARIPO, strengthening national intellectual property organization. Even there has been a proposal around for some time now to create a Pan-African intellectual property organization. But there are other regulatory measures, including the trade ones, such as the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, a range of regimes for trade, but also for regulation. And regulation here is governing STI, such as technical standards. And then the other strategic objective is really policy reforms, harmonizing policies, investing in science diplomacy, so that Africa starts to use science for diplomacy science for policy. If you recall, in Module 2, we talked about the role of science in diplomacy, science for peace, science for conflict resolution, but science to address a number of policy challenges, including informing decisions to address the current crisis, climate change, or even more pronounced crisis, COVID-19, and then facilitating resource mobilization. So those are the objectives. Then you have 6 agreed upon priority areas, which are related to the objectives, but also very well aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals, aligned with the aspirations in Agenda 2063. They are actually drawn from Agenda 2063, and the first has to do with the persistent challenge of hunger and food security. African leaders agree that they want to focus on food security around SDG 2, ending hunger, feeding Africans. And this priority is largely informed by the view that if Africa cannot feed itself, it's not going to be competitive. Africa has to address the food problems, malnutrition, which undermines Africa's sovereignty, social dignity. People that cannot feed themselves cannot actually protect their sovereignty. They cannot be assertive. So countries that do not feed themselves cannot be assertive in many ways. So that's the first priority. And we have to think of various programs. In STISA, the emphasis again is on this problem. It's not about just food production. You can produce food, but you can't feed yourself. To achieve food security, you actually do not need to produce everything yourself. So it's a food security hunger issue. You have to increase agriculture production, but you also have to deal with the problems of food loss, food distribution, and so on. Then the second priority is really prevention and control of diseases, which is aligned to SDG 3, health and well-being. And at that time, when STISA was being developed, it was clear to African leaders that epidemics, Ebola, HIV and AIDS, the huge burden of disease associated with the tuberculosis, cancer, diabetes, malaria, even all the problems of cholera still persisting on the continent. Again, I agree that for Africa to be assertive, Africa has to address these problems, prevent and control diseases, and to very clear that without new knowledge or deploying existing knowledge, without new technologies, without innovations, Africa will not reduce its huge burden of disease, prevent epidemics and diseases in general, improve human health. A number of very specific initiatives around HIV/AIDS, which had been launched during the CPA period, were proposed to be continued. A number of new initiatives, for example, gene sequencing of genomes, strengthening capabilities in health biotechnology, for example, production of vaccines, detection of viruses, and dealing with a range of health issues. Agreed, and that priority there. Then the other is communication. That if you don't deal with the communication issues in Africa, whether digital communication, ICT-related barriers, or just mobility of Africans, African scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs, you'll not be able to address the problems. You'll not get an Africa that shares it is relatively scarce scientific and technological resources. So priority 2 is really around communication, both physical but mobility, having common protocols for that. Then the fourth, which was very difficult to get agreement on, even through the CPA, was really protection of our space. But space here defined largely to be around space science, the use of space science to address challenges associated with the food production, with the diseases and the others, but also ecological challenges, degradation of natural resources, oceans, the loss of biodiversity, and so forth. So there is emphasis that Africa has to protect its space. And those of you who may be following Africa's efforts to strengthen its work on space science and technology will know that there's actually Pan-African now space science plan that was adopted, and a number of countries are leading that process. Then there is a very crucial priority, which is living together about peace. If you don't have a peaceful Africa, if some African countries are continuously investing in war, fighting among themselves, you not build a cohesive society. You will actually not have a national system of national systems of innovation at country levels. So peace is very crucial, and you can actually harness science, technology, and innovation to achieve this priority, using different technologies or innovation pathways out of conflicts. Some of my recent work around fisheries, mining, show that you can actually use innovation, new technologies, GPS, geographic information systems, drones, and so on, to create new opportunities in agriculture, in fisheries, in mining, and get communities that compete for perceived or real scarcity of resources to have new sources of income, diversify economies, and live together peacefully. So STI is so crucial for the attainment of peace and security in Africa, not just for economic competitiveness. And we can discuss this in more way. So then you have priority 6, which is really been articulated in many national frameworks, is economic competitiveness, but redefined or reframed in some measure to focus on economic inclusivity, so that you are not just dealing with growth, but you want to make sure that you have jobs for young people, you have women engaged in economic production, and other social activities using science, technology, and innovation. So you have 6 priorities which are interrelated in STISA. And we need to look at these priorities again as in a holistic way. You cannot achieve the first priority if you don't focus on the 5th priority. If you don't have this, you will not eradicate hunger and achieve food security. If you don't address the issues of social and economic exclusion, you will not be able to achieve the first and second priorities. If we don't protect our environment, we will not be able to have a peaceful and stable continent. So 6, really a package of 6 priorities. And in the context of STISA, these are to be implemented over a period of time, starting off with the 10-year, 5 plans, but medium term being 10 years. And you may have noted that at high levels of governance at the African Union, different of these priorities are being addressed in some way or form. The challenge is to actually articulate the roles that science and technology play to achieve these priorities. For example, the whole of last year, the African Union was dedicated to priority 5, peace and security, ending guns under the leadership of South Africa. The African Union spent most of last year focused on priority 5. As we discussed, unfortunately, again, because of limited understanding of how STI can help the content achieve this priority, living together, peace and security, building a cohesive society. STI did not feature some attempts by a number of departments or actors to get STI onto the agenda. Did not really make much of a difference, also because of time, because most of last year, as is this year, spent on really figuring out how to get out of this crisis, the pandemic, COVID-19. So please look at the strategy, and then try to think of how your own countries, in their STI policy frameworks, their STI policy regimes, have addressed these priorities. Are these priorities being embedded in the national frameworks, and how? Are there any specific policy measures? And again, the emphasis here is that if you move to modern STI policy frameworks, alignment with SDGs, very crucial, addressing social, economic, and environmental sustainability considerations, as opposed to the traditional way of addressing the economic competitiveness agenda, which has not really worked for any country. You have to really look at these social, economic, and environmental considerations, and how STI are to be governed to achieve this integrated social, economic, and environmental goals. Because, as we discussed, if we just leave them on their own, STI will not make a difference, or even they could be very disruptive. They will destroy companies, existing companies. They will marginalize certain communities. So policies that promote SDGs are crucial. Then implementation strategy in cities, and we'll discuss this later on. is relatively broad, general, recognition that you need implementation at least 3 levels of governance, the continental level, and a number of institutional arrangements are proposed at the continental level with the leadership of the African Union Commission, the African Union Development Agency, the former NEPAD. Then we'll talk about the African Observatory of Science, Technology and Innovation, AOSTI, which was created about 9 years ago or so. Has its headquarters in Equatorial Guinea and has been leading, together with NEPAD, R&D and innovation surveys. Dr. Conte will lead us through a discussion during our next webinar on the role of this very important institution. It was actually one of the CPS outcomes, recognition that you require an observatory to monitor trends in STI, to monitor investments in STI, to monitor implementation of STI policies. And then you have international actors, UN agencies such as the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, providing leadership, supporting African countries to build capacity through such a course. There was a proposal, there is still a proposal to create an African STI fund. We tried working on that through the CPA, and because of various political economy barriers, not much has happened. Then at regional level, you have the RECs and the associated bodies. In module 3, again, we reflected a bit on what has happened at the RECs. One is that you have these regional treaties that already have STI consideration, or at least S and T considerations. Many of them are weak on innovation. But at regional levels, you have treaties actually, not just policies, relatively authoritative frameworks, which require countries through regional cooperation to invest in STI, to engage in collective activities in STI. Then at national level, that's really where the actions are supposed to be. Again, by actions, I mean policies, and policies being implemented, not just being designed, with engagement of governments, civil society, private sector, academia, and other actors. I'm going to end this module by just giving a sense of perceptions on the relevance and effectiveness of STISA. And this, you get this from different political statements. If you talk to various persons, and on my own reflections on this, based on the work that we've been doing in a number of countries in the recent past. One is that there is recognition that STISA is highly relevant. It's a relevant framework. If we do not invest in developing and adopting STISA, we would have to do it. We'll have to do it. There are regions in Latin America and Asia, sub-regions that are learning from STISA, that to get collective engagement, to focus on shared priorities, you need regional frameworks. But it's also become very clear from the European Union that STISA is really a framework to engage Africa. So a lot of European Union Africa engagements are through the African Union. Around STISA, you have African Union, European Union high-level policy body on STI, and the priorities are largely the STISA priorities. For example, most of last year and this year, the African Union, EU high-level body has been focusing on digital transformation of Africa with emphasis on ICTs, which is a priority on communication to a large extent, physical and intellectual mobility, digitizing, transforming communication on the continent. So there's also recognition that is really aligned to the global, continental, and many of the national vision statements of most countries. Some countries that adopted their national development vision statements before STISA actually informed the priorities, the setting of STISA priorities, but it has informed a number of recent vision statements, and some countries are revising their 2030 vision statements to guided by the STISA priorities, and we can discuss that in detail. There's also just a general perception that for us to demonstrate its effectiveness, it's relevant, but to be effective, there has to be national domestication. And we'll discuss the notion of national domestication in the next module. And again, through the African Observatory of Science, Technology and Innovation, AOSTI, and various academic statements, the view that you can't do very much with the strategy or on the strategy if you don't have a clear implementation plan with a monitoring and evaluation framework at the global level, at the African level, and then most important at the national levels. And this a challenge that you recall in when we discuss national experiences, challenge that countries have to confront. Most countries do not have implementation plans. They have STI policies or policy frameworks, but they don't have plans to implement them. Some spend too much time designing the plans. When the plans are adopted, the policy frameworks are outdated. Monitoring and evaluation, very key part of the policy process, we recall again. It's a process that is largely based on this monitoring and evaluation, and one would add learning. Policy making is all about monitoring, evaluation, and learning. Problems change, technologies change, knowledge is accumulated. So you have to monitor and evaluate your national system of innovation, your policy frameworks, your policy instruments, the effectiveness of those. But with STISA, I think the effectiveness, its effectiveness is largely undermined by the absence of monitoring and evaluation frameworks at various levels of governance. Then there's also a general view, which is expressed in a number of reports, that political capital that was built with the CPA, with the adoption of STISA itself in 2014, is being eroded because there isn't very much of collective action on the strategy. So we need to really, in the next module, reflect on how do we then move into implementation. I'm going to pause for a minute, and then we get into module 6, which I'm going to largely raise questions for our discussions on Saturday. And questions, because there isn't much work done actually on the domestication of STISA, and we'll be perhaps the first group to spend our energies carefully reflecting on how we translate this strategy into practices.